What if the man you traveled 2,000 miles to marry never showed up? No note, no explanation. Just an empty train platform, a stranger's town, and 6 months of letters that turned out to be built on a lie. That's exactly what happened to a young woman in 1890s Montana. And what happened next is the kind of story that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about love, patience, and second chances. Stick with me here, because this isn't just some dusty old Western tale. This is a story about what happens when the life you planned falls apart in front of you. And a completely different, better life shows up wearing muddy boots and saying almost nothing at all. We've all had that moment where something we counted on just didn't happen. A job that fell through. A person who wasn't who they said they were. This story is that feeling, turned up to 11, set against the Montana mountains. So let's get into it. Picture a young woman named Margaret Ashby, 23 years old, sitting on a train with a bundle of letters tied in ribbon resting in her lap. She's read them so many times the paper has gone soft, like fabric instead of paper. Margaret grew up in a cramped mill town back east, the kind of place where the sky was always a little gray from smoke, and sunlight was something you had to go looking for. Her parents were gone. All she had left was a small inheritance, one trunk of belongings, and a newspaper ad she'd placed herself. The kind that basically said, "Young woman seeks honest man out west, marriage intended." One man answered. His name was Elias Bardwell, and unlike the flowery, over the top replies she got from other men, his letters were plain and steady. He wrote about his ranch, about the mountains, about a creek that stayed cold and clear even in August. And in one letter, he answered a question she'd been too shy to even fully ask. What was the house like? He told her the kitchen window faced east. She'd have morning sun on her face while she baked bread. That one detail did something to her. It wasn't romantic poetry. It was a picture of a life. A future she could actually see herself standing inside. So she got on a train, alone, and rode 3 days west to meet a man she had never once laid eyes on. Here's the part that's easy to miss on a first read. Margaret wasn't naive. She was smart, capable, and had survived on her own already. She just did what any of us would do. She trusted words on a page, because words were all she had to go on. And if you think about it, that's not so different from someone today swiping through a dating app profile or trusting a job offer that sounded a little too perfect. We still fall for good writing. Some things about people never change. The train pulled into a tiny mountain town. Margaret stepped off, smoothed her dress, and looked around for a tall man with dark hair, exactly as Elias had described himself in his last letter. Nobody was there. She told herself there were 100 reasonable explanations. A horse could have thrown a shoe. A calf could have wandered off. She sat on the one wooden bench on that platform and waited, the way she'd waited her whole life for things to work out. The sun dropped behind the mountains. The air turned cold. The station agent locked up the building and walked off without a word. And somewhere in that silence, the truth landed on her like a stone dropping into still water. He wasn't coming. She was alone, in a town she'd never seen, as darkness closed in around her. That's when she heard hooves in the dark. A rider appeared, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. He slowed his horse near the platform and just looked at her for a long moment. Most men would have kept riding. He didn't. He climbed down, walked over, and introduced himself simply Caleb Ford. He didn't ask who she'd been waiting for. He didn't ask what happened. Somehow he understood that whatever the answer was, it wasn't his business to pry into. Not yet, anyway. He told her there was a boarding house in town, run by a decent woman, and offered to carry her trunk. That was it. No charm, no big speech. Just quiet, practical kindness from a total stranger. He walked her into town, dropped her trunk on the porch of the boarding house, quietly told the owner to put the cost on his account, and disappeared into the night without another word. The boarding house was run by a sharp-eyed, big-hearted woman named Ruth Callahan, who also happened to be the town's postmistress, which made her the one person who knew everything happening in that town before anyone else did. She didn't pry into Margaret's story either. She just fed her, gave her chores to earn her keep, and let her heal on her own time. Margaret only saw Caleb Ford once that week, riding into town for supplies, not even glancing toward the boarding house. He wasn't cold, exactly. He was just a man who kept to himself. But something about him stuck with her. Then, on the 7th day, he showed up at the boarding house and asked for her by name. He didn't waste time with small talk. He told her flat out that he had a ranch to run and a set of account books that hadn't been touched properly in 3 years. Ruth had mentioned Margaret was good with numbers and handwriting. He needed help. He'd pay a fair wage, plus her room and board. It wasn't romantic. It was a job offer. But to a woman with nowhere else to go, it was a lifeline. And more than that, it was purpose. Something to do with her hands and her mind besides grieving a future that never existed. She said yes before he even finished the sentence. Caleb's ranch sat 5 miles outside of town, right along the very creek that Elias Bardwell had described in his letters. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd get her creek and her mountains after all, just not from the man who'd promised them. The house was solid but bare, built by hands that knew how to work, but not how to decorate. He gave her a small room off the main house to use as an office, really just a storage space with a desk shoved into the corner. "It's not much," he said, almost embarrassed. She told him it would do just fine, and then she got to work. The ledgers were a genuine disaster. Receipts stuffed randomly between pages. Whole months of records just missing. But for Margaret, this wasn't a burden. It was a puzzle, and puzzles gave her something other people's cruelty couldn't take away. A sense of control. Caleb was gone most days, out working the land from sunrise to sunset. But on the 3rd morning, she found a cup of hot black coffee sitting on the corner of her desk. No note. No explanation. Just there. It kept happening. Every single morning. He never mentioned it, and she never brought it up. It became this small, silent ritual between 2 people who mostly communicated by what they did, not what they said. Here's the thing I find fascinating about this part of the story. Psychologists actually have a name for this. It's sometimes called acts of service, as a love language. But what's happening here is deeper than that. Caleb isn't performing affection for an audience. Nobody's watching. He's not trying to impress her. He's just quietly, consistently showing up for her in the smallest way he knows how. And weirdly, that kind of unwatched consistency is often far more convincing than any grand romantic gesture. Anyone can write a beautiful letter once. Almost nobody keeps making coffee for a stranger every single morning without ever asking for credit. Weeks passed like this. He'd catch her in the doorway sometimes, the afternoon light catching in her hair while she worked, and he'd say nothing and go back outside. One afternoon he set a small hand-carved wooden bird on her desk. A lark, wings and feathers carved in careful detail. When she asked about it, he just shrugged and mumbled something about his hands getting restless, then walked out before she could say more. She kept that bird on her desk. Whenever the old loneliness crept back in, she'd run her thumb over its wooden feathers. By late August, she'd finished the books. 3 years of chaos turned into clean, organized columns. She handed him the ledger on the porch one evening, and he looked through it slowly, not really reading the numbers, just staring at the neatness of it. The order she'd built out of nothing. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. The job was done. There was no more reason for her to stay. And for a moment, they both just sat there in that awkward, charged silence until he mumbled something about the pantry needing organizing and the mending piling up. She offered to help with both. He said yes a little too fast, so she stayed. Not as an employee anymore. Not really. More like someone who'd quietly become part of the household. She cooked. She mended his shirts. She planted a pot of red geraniums on the porch, a small, stubborn splash of color against all that weathered gray wood. He never said a word about the flowers, but she caught him watering them one morning when he thought nobody was looking. Then, one ordinary afternoon in the post office, Ruth Callahan was sorting mail and mentioned, almost as an aside, a letter addressed to a Mrs. Bardwell, from a man who apparently worked the railroad and wrote home every single month like clockwork. The name Bardwell. Ruth had only ever heard that name once before. Margaret's face went white. In that instant, Ruth understood everything. The ad, the empty platform. The quiet shame Margaret had carried for months without ever explaining it. Elias Bardwell hadn't gotten cold feet. He hadn't changed his mind. He'd already had a wife the entire time he was writing those letters to Margaret. He wasn't a man who backed out. He was a fraud who'd been playing with her hope for entertainment, all while living a completely different life a few counties over. Margaret walked back to the ranch in a daze, dust rising around her boots with every step, and found Caleb by the corral fixing a fence rail. She told him everything, calm and steady on the outside, even though her insides were anything but. His jaw went tight. He offered to write to the sheriff. There were laws against this kind of thing, he said. Justice was right there for the taking. But Margaret thought it through. A sheriff's letter meant an investigation. An investigation meant her name and her humiliation becoming the biggest story the county had heard all year. She'd be known forever as the fool who got left at a train station. And what would that actually give her back? Not her pride. Not the months she'd spent grieving a life that was never real. "I'd rather move forward than look back," she told him. And that decision, to let go of revenge and choose her own dignity instead, was the moment everything shifted for Caleb. He'd grown so used to having her around. The smell of bread in the kitchen, the sound of her pen scratching across paper, her quiet company on the porch each evening. He realized, almost too late, that the thought of this house going back to silence and emptiness was unbearable to him now. That evening on the porch, under a sky just starting to fill with stars, Caleb finally said what he'd been sitting on for weeks. He wasn't a man of fancy words, he told her. He was slow to notice things, slow to say what he meant. But he saw her. He saw what she'd built in his house and in his life without either of them planning it. And he didn't want this house to go back to being empty. He asked her to stay, not as his bookkeeper this time, but as his wife. There was no big romantic speech, no borrowed poetry, nothing like the beautiful lies she'd once read in another man's letters. Just a plain, honest offer from a man who meant every word of it. Margaret looked at him. His steady eyes, the calluses on his hands, the life they'd already quietly built together, without either of them naming it. And told him she'd been hoping he would ask. They married 2 months later in the small town church, with Ruth Callahan crying happy tears in the front row and half the town turning out because, honestly, everyone had watched this story unfold and they all wanted to see how it ended. Fast forward 5 years. Same porch, same mountains, golden evening light. Margaret's in her rocking chair, mending a small shirt, while their 5-year-old son chases a very unbothered chicken around the yard, and their 3-year-old daughter, with her father's same serious eyes, lines up pebbles in the dirt with total concentration. Caleb sits down beside her, after a long day of branding calves, tired in the good way, and tucks a strand of hair behind her ear, without even thinking about it. And here's the detail that gets me every time: the kitchen window in that house faces east. Just like Elias Bardwell once promised her in a lie. She gets her morning sun after all. She just had to survive a heartbreak, an empty train platform, and a season of quiet grief to get there. And it came from a completely different man who never once tried to sell her a dream. He just kept showing up. Here's what gets me about this story. Margaret didn't get the life she planned. She got a better one. But only because she was willing to keep going after the plan she'd bet everything on completely fell apart on. That empty platform. Maybe you've had your own version of this. A relationship, a job, a plan for your life that you built your hope around, only to watch it not show up. If that's you right now, I want you to sit with this for a second. Sometimes the version of life you're actually meant for doesn't arrive with beautiful promises. Sometimes it shows up quietly, on horseback in the dark, when you least expect it. And it earns your trust 1 cup of coffee at a time. So here's my question for you. What empty platform are you sitting on right now, still waiting for someone who already told you, in 100 small ways, that they're not coming? Maybe it's time to stop waiting on the train and start paying attention to who's already walking toward you. If this story hit you the way it hit me, drop a comment and let me know what you think really happens next for Margaret and Caleb. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, because there are plenty more where this came from.